And good evening, and welcome to the happenings in Medfield. This evening I have a special guest, an elder affairs attorney. There's been a lot of comments from seniors as to the new issues of Medicare, Medicaid, and other specific areas that are extremely confusing. And that is where an elder affairs attorney is the best person to talk to. And so without further ado, it is always my pleasure, as I have known this gentleman for a number of years, to introduce you to Mr. John J. McNicholas, elder affairs attorney at law. Jack, nice to have you.
Jack, good to be here. It's been a while.
It has been.
Thank goodness we're not getting any older.
Almost certainly not.
That's right. We let other people do that for us.
That's the way I feel. Just let them go ahead, but
that's right.
We'll sit and watch them.
That's right.
Jack, let's open with one important Medicaid and how that works and the situations involving it.
And I think every time we talk about Medicaid, I think of that old question, define the universe, give two examples and why. It can go on forever with Medicaid, but Medicaid is the program that basically provides medical insurance for folks that are of low income or low assets. And with most seniors, Medicaid comes into play if the unfortunate event arises that they end up needing long-term nursing home care. There is community Medicaid for folks who are living at home that provides some health insurance benefits. Medicaid isn't an income program, basically it's a health insurance program. And where all of the issues and controversies come in is with Medicaid providing for long-term care, either in a nursing home or there is now, well, it has been for a while, but it's becoming more popular, what's called a home and community-based waiver, where a person can actually stay in their home and if they require a nursing home, skilled nursing level of services, have help from Medicaid in paying for that. And the controversy, the debate, the dilemma with Medicaid for a long time has been it's expensive. It's paid for by federal money and state money. It's administered under a set of federal laws and regulations, and then each state has their own laws and regulations. So there's a little bit of variance from one state to another. But if a person ends up going to a nursing home, for instance, in this local area, we deal with Medicaid in nursing homes and all the time, and I would say that the average daily cost right now is around $340 a day. Some are higher than that, some are lower than that. So quick math, on my fingers, you're talking about $10,000 a month for private nursing home care. That's a pretty expensive proposition.
Very.
Unless someone has, enough money, resources, assets that they've accumulated through a lifetime of hard work or otherwise. If you have a couple of $1 million that you can invest the right way, you might be able to generate $100,000 a year and sort of self-insure to pretty much cover that cost. But for the average person, the people that we see as clients all the time that have worked a couple of jobs and paid for their house and paid off the mortgage and had the mortgage burning party and might have a couple of $100,000 in the bank. These are not rich people when you start looking at expending $10,000 a month on a nursing home. So the other ways to pay for nursing home care are either some people have long-term care insurance, which is a good thing if you're young enough and healthy enough to qualify for long-term care insurance, at a reasonable enough price. Or when you can no longer pay privately, you need to be able to qualify for Medicaid. So and then Medicaid will help pick up the cost of the nursing home care, basically the difference between a person's income, which pretty much would go to the nursing home, and the cost of the nursing home at a Medicaid rate, which is a lower daily rate. You never know exactly unless they're trying to recover the money, but typically the rate is probably about 70% or 2/3 of the private rate. So at $340 a day, maybe it's $220 a day. It's a lower rate, and then Medicaid pays the difference after a person's income.
What is it and necessary to qualify?
Well, in order to qualify for Medicaid, and let's talk first about just an individual, because there are different rules for married couples. But for an individual, your assets have to be below $2,000, your countable assets. Okay? Non-countable assets include your home. One of the myths out there or misunderstandings is if you go into a nursing home before you can qualify to Medicaid, for Medicaid, they are going to take your house. That's really not true. You can own your home and qualify for Medicaid. You can also have one automobile. You can have a prepaid funeral contract. In other words, you go to Tracy Mitchell and say, okay, when I die, this is what I want, and he goes through the whole process and says to you, okay, this is going to cost X thousand dollars. You write a check and they give you an irrevocable contract, and so you've taken the money and prepaid for the funeral. It's something that is going to be used at some point down the road, and Medicaid will not count the value of that contract. You can also have $1,500 in a separate bank account for other burial or death-related expenses, and as long as you don't touch it, that's exempt. But pretty much everything else has to be spent down to $2,000. And the other criteria is that you cannot have made any uncompensated gifts within 5 years before you apply for Medicaid. We can talk a little more about that, but
Jack, if, we'll say hypothetically, a person has been interested in Medicaid, but they have X number of dollars in the bank, the minimum is $2,000, so they decide, well, what I'll do is transfer this balance to my son, so I'm qualified at $2,000. Is that permissible?
generally, no. Again, if it's done within 5 years before you apply. What the Medicaid regulations say in simple terms, in terms of asset transfers, is if you give away assets, money, it's the simple example. It could be stock, it could be investment accounts, it could be real estate, it could be your home. Even though your home doesn't count as an asset for eligibility, if you give it away, it's penalized the same as any other transfer. What Medicaid says is if you have I'm going to use 90,000 because it's easier. If you have $90,000 in the bank and you give it away to your son, and within 5 years, there's a 5-year look-back period when you apply for Medicaid for transfers. The application says, in the last 5 years, have you given anything away? Okay? If you give away that $90,000 and it's within 5 years before you apply, they take the value of what was given away, they divide it by the statewide average cost of a nursing home, which is $300 a day. So 90,000 divided by 300 is what? 300, I believe. Okay? So you're disqualified for about 10 months for Medicaid because you gave the money away. And in the old days, pre-2006, when the laws changed, the 10-month penalty would start running when you made the transfer. So if it was 2 years ago, 10 months is over and you're eligible. Now, if you make a transfer within that 5-year look-back period, they take the transferred value, they bring it forward to the day that you would otherwise be eligible for Medicaid because you've spent down your other assets, and they penalize you 10 months into the future when you don't have any money. So therefore, in very simple terms, if you make any uncompensated transfer that is not for some purpose other than to qualify for Medicaid, then you're effectively going to be penalized when you have no funds. And the theory is relatively simple. Medicaid says if you have money you could spend on the nursing home or on long-term care and you give it away, we, Medicaid, are not going to pay for the amount of time the money you gave away would have paid for had you kept it. And
Next question, Jack, relative to what you had mentioned at the beginning. Rather than the nursing home, if you want to stay at home, how does that work out?
Okay. And actually, just before we get to that, Jack, I wanted to add one other thing about the transfers. One of the issues that comes up on someone giving away money, I mean, the example you gave, someone thinking they may have to go into a nursing home and they give the money to their son, that's going to be penalized. There's kind of no question about it, okay? But we encounter situations, particularly where they look back 5 years but don't penalize you until now. Grandma is perfectly healthy, okay? And she has 3 grandchildren, who are all in college. She's driving around, she's got a good income, she doesn't have a whole lot of expenses, and she wants to help the 3 grandchildren. So she gives them each $30,000 to use toward college. 4.5 years later, she has a stroke and ends up in the nursing home and applies for Medicaid. Did she give away that $90,000 with the intent of qualifying for Medicaid? The logical answer is no, but Mass Health, who is the state Medicaid agency, has generally taken the position that any transfer in the last 5 years is a disqualifying transfer. So the Massachusetts chapter of the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, which is a nationwide organization, is about 4,400 attorneys, and Massachusetts has almost 500 of the 4,400. So we're a good-sized chapter, very active, and I've been on the board of directors there for almost 10 years. But we, every year, have 2 or 3 pieces of legislation. Right now I have a list here. There's about 7 or 8 that we are supporting and working on, and periodically they get passed. And one of the pieces of legislation that we have pending is to establish some kind of objective standard for these transfers, so that in the case of grandma giving the $30,000 apiece to the 3 grandchildren for college 4 years ago, that would objectively not be considered with the intent to qualify for Medicaid. Because right now it's a very subjective standard, which is really impossible to prove. So there are some good things going on. Oftentimes elder law attorneys are perceived by the legislature and others as just simply trying to help people hide money and hide assets in order to qualify for Medicaid. And it's not always true.
Jack, I wonder if you might go into, as you had said, because of them being on the board, some of the areas that are being presented relative to, and you have a list there. I wonder if you could name a few.
Yeah, well, that is one of the issues, one of the bills that is pending, and all of these are making a little bit of progress through the legislature, but legislature is pretty much wrapping up its formal 2-year session now. The legislature runs in 2-year sessions, and some of our bills are making more progress, than they have. Some of these have been kicking around for a while. There was one on long-term care insurance that was passed about a year and a half ago. That was really about an 8-year battle, where if you have long-term care insurance, that meets the criteria established by the Mass Health regulations when it was purchased, okay, regardless of whether you use that for home care or whatever, when Medicaid pays for a person's care and they own a home, they can put a lien on the home during the person's lifetime, so that if the property is sold and you take the non-countable home, turn it into cash, Medicaid can immediately recover at the sale everything they paid up to that point. Or if the person dies and they own a home in their own name, Medicaid can recover against the probate estate. Well, there's a regulation that says if you have long-term care insurance that meets the criteria, then Medicaid cannot recover against your estate, so-called estate recovery. But for years, Mass Health was implementing it based on the value of the long-term care insurance when you went into the nursing home. So that if you had a minimum policy and you used some of it for home care and then went into the nursing home, they were saying, aha, it's not the full value, so therefore you don't qualify for the estate recovery waiver. And we were successful in, along with a lot of other groups, in getting that law changed to clarify that you could use it for home care. As I mentioned, there is the bill to even the playing field in terms of a more objective standard for intent when transfers are made, so that things like helping a child who's going through some tough times. I mean, I use the college example, but a son or a daughter is being foreclosed on because they've lost their job and they're going to lose their house, and mom or dad or both give them $50,000 to get caught up and pay off the mortgage and pay off bills and stabilize the situation. That's not done with the intent of qualifying for Medicaid, and that bill is making substantial progress. Another one is with a husband and wife applying for Medicaid. If one of the spouses is applying for Medicaid, the community spouse, the one that is not in the nursing home or not applying, is allowed to keep, right now it's $117,000 and change of assets for the community spouse, plus the $2,000 for the spouse in the nursing home. Okay, everything over that $119,000 is considered to be available to be spent on the nursing home. And oftentimes we see situations where the community spouse has his or her own retirement funds, IRAs or 401k or various retirement plans. That's money set aside that they will then draw on for their retirement. And the regulations say that in Massachusetts, that only retirement funds that are in a plan with the spouse's current employer are exempt from being counted in that $119,000 that the two can keep. And things like IRAs or 401k or 403b or different plans from prior employees are considered to be countable, even though they're the spouse's retirement funds. And one of the bills that we now have pending in the legislature, which again is making, the legislature moves with glacial speed, right?
Right.
Okay, even with global warming, it's still glacial speed. But another of the bills that we've had pending for a while is to do what many, many other states do. I think there's 17 or 18 states that will exempt the community spouses' retirement funds, IRAs, and other retirement plans from being part of the countable assets, provided that the community spouse is either still working or is starting to take at least the minimum distribution that you need to take from your retirement each year. And that would be a huge step, because you often encounter situations where the community spouse may be substantially younger than the spouse in the nursing home. Or I was just reading on our listserv about a situation that a colleague has where the wife is going into, or is in a nursing home now in her 60s with early onset Alzheimer's, which is, just that alone is devastating, never mind the financial hit. And the husband is still working as a custodian or a sexton in a church, and he has some retirement funds from a previous employment, and they want to count his previous funds. And then it's left to attorneys like us to do what the legislature would say are all these clever, devious things, but then we have to work within the regulations to find a way to protect that money, which usually means turning it into an annuity and getting it all back in a flow of income. But if it's taxable money, you have to do a tax-qualified annuity. And it just becomes multiple levels of complication to work within the rules to help folks in a really difficult situation. So
it sounds very, very, to the average individual, very, very confusing. That's why they need an elder attorney to sit down and start to map out and formulate and coordinate a program of Medicaid. I had asked earlier relative to living at home.
Yeah.
How does that constitute?
Well, and that's another whole issue, Jack, that I used to a lot of times speak to groups of seniors and be glad to do it some more. But, you'd always ask the question, how many people here want to go to a nursing home? Well, how many hands do you think ever went up?
Very few.
Very few. I think very few is defined as zero. I never once saw someone raise their hand. And actually, I was doing a presentation on the that intent to transfer legislation at a breakfast meeting with our McNicholas chapter, and also there were geriatric care managers and other professionals in the area. And I asked the same question: how many people want to go to a nursing home? No hands. At least in that group, when I said, how many people think they might end up, of necessity, going to a nursing home? There were a few that sheepishly put up their hand and admitted it's possible. But folks don't want to go to nursing homes. And for a long time, if you kind of ran out of assets, nursing home was about the only alternative that you could get some help with the payment, with Medicaid. Now there is what's called a frail elder waiver, a home and community-based services waiver. All the acronyms and alphabet soup that you deal with government. But it's actually a good program. I've had a couple of clients that have done it where basically you are certified medically as needing a skilled nursing facility level of care that Medicaid would pay for, but you want to stay in your own home and have those services provided in the home. So there is a rather convoluted linking of 3 or 4 or 5 regulations that lead you to the conclusion that you can not create, but what happens is you sort of have this Medicaid program that will pay for your care in your home as long as you meet the medical criteria. Your assets still have to be down to $2,000. It's typically still subject to estate recovery. If you own your own home in your own name and you die, then it goes through probate and they can make recovery. What's interesting is I have a case, and I was just half an hour before I came over here talking to the person at the estate recovery unit for Mass Health, and this lady passed away last November, and from May until November, for about 6 months, she had qualified for the home and community-based waiver, the frail elder waiver in her home. And Medicaid had approved $98,000 for 1 year of care. And she lasted about 6 months. She was almost 102. still played the piano every day until the last couple of weeks. Very special lady. And she had long-term care insurance that, believe it or not, didn't have any home care component, but she spent all of her own money. She had this long-term care insurance, so there was no lien against the house while she was living because it qualified for the exemption. And when she passed away, Estate Recovery made a claim, but I've been talking to the person at Estate Recovery and saying, okay, I will get you the long-term care policy, because even though she was living in her home, she had a nursing home level of care, so therefore, with the long-term care insurance, she qualifies for, so in other words, Mass Health will not recover $45,000 or $48,000 against the proceeds from the sale of the house. And what's interesting there is that in order to be eligible for this waiver, you have to have the long-term care policy that qualifies. You have to indicate that you do not intend to return to your home on your Mass Health application, and you have to be in a skilled nursing facility. Well, the lady's still at home, living in her home, yet in fact she qualifies because her home, when you string together 3 or 4 definitions, becomes a skilled nursing facility under this program. And she does not intend to return to her home as her home, even though she's living in her home, because it's a skilled nursing facility. So these are the crazy regulations that we deal with.
Certainly sounds like it.
You piece them together. And I've been doing this for 34 years in the elder law field, and I'm confused some days, except we sort through it. And I always tell people, you've got to do it slowly. Because if you get going like this, it'll make your mind explode.
One more question, Jack.
Sure.
Hypothetic. Suppose an elderly woman lives with her son and her daughter in her son's home.
Yep.
But she has X number of dollars in the bank.
Yep.
And it is time to apply for Medicaid. What happens in a case of that nature?
Well, any number of things. If she's living in the home, but she doesn't have any ownership interest in the home.
No.
Okay, in your hypothetical. With a little bit of advanced planning, if she anticipates that at some point down the road she may need skilled nursing care or something beyond the care that can be provided in that home, she could use her money to purchase a joint ownership interest in the home, or a life estate, which is a lesser valued interest, depending upon the amount of funds that she has. If she purchases a life estate in the home, then under the regulations, in order for that not to be a gift to the son, she has to have had the life estate and lived in the home for at least a year after she purchases the life estate. But sometimes purchasing a joint interest works. It's a little more problematic if the house is worth $300,000 and the son and daughter-in-law own the house jointly, and mom has $100,000 and she pays them $100,000, and they put all three, and they change the ownership to son, daughter-in-law, and mom, each one having essentially a 1/3 interest, even though they own it jointly, and then she goes to the nursing home the next day, that may be a problem to sell. So I mean, something like that, if you anticipate things down the road, or just think that it might be a possibility some days, that's where advanced planning, like anything, is always good. Some smart old gentleman, much smarter and wiser than I, always used to say something to the effect of plan your work and work your plan.
Which is very true. Because I find that, we'll say, an elderly person lives with her son and daughter. No money really involved. Maybe she has 4 or 5,000 in the bank, and that's about it. And they want mom home. They don't want mom in a nursing home. And it's time to qualify for Medicaid.
Well,
Does that create a bit of a problem too?
No, not really, because I mean, financially she's going to be eligible, and she wants to stay at home, but she needs a certain level of care. Because I mean, all of this is paying the cost of the care, regardless of what the venue is or how it's done. And so, if she needs skilled nursing care in the home, then someone like that could be a very good candidate for the for the frail elder home and community-based waiver. In other words, apply for Medicaid, either for community Medicaid that will help supplement some services. Medicare will help with some services in the home. But arguably, like, my 102-year-old lady, if she needs, and this lady was getting 24-hour a day, round-the-clock caregivers.
Right.
Okay, and she reached a point that, she couldn't stay at home without it, but they, her daughters and she, they just didn't want to get her into a nursing home, and she managed to live her life at home. And so it can be done, and some of these programs, will do that. And there are plenty of options and alternatives out there. Sometimes in a situation like that where someone is trying to figure out, how do I pay for care, or what do I need, you do very well to talk with a geriatric care manager. And I mean, if you just Google Massachusetts geriatric care managers, there's an association, like we have the Elder Law group, that will list all of them. And these folks are really good. They're usually either social workers or nurses by profession, and they can do two things. They can do assessment with the family to see, okay, here's your living situation, here's your health situation. What do you want, first of all? Where do you want to be, and what do you need to maintain you safely, comfortably, happily in whatever environment you choose? And then they can also be advocates for helping you get the services. I mean, there's every area. HESCO is the one that covers Medfield. There are all sorts of services provided to seniors through HESCO or whatever their sister organization would be in the other regions in the state. So there's a lot of things out there, a lot of resources to tap to try to get
Jack, that's
the best care.
That's the unfortunate part. A lot of the elders are not aware of certain circumstances to follow. They're not aware of things that you've been covering. And so all of a sudden, a situation may arise that they're going to be needing help. And that's why I say it's so important for the elderly to talk to elder affairs attorneys and plan your work. Because of that factor, then you feel safe, the family feels safe, that those situations are being taken care of. Because all of a sudden, if a stroke appears or some other unfortunate circumstances, and all of a sudden you sit there and say, now what do I do? And there are many facilities available, but who knows?
Well, that's it. And, we kid all the time about, the crystal ball is out of order, because no one has a crystal ball. We cannot predict with any certainty sometimes exactly what's going to happen, with or to anyone. When I sit with clients and we're kind of trying to develop some sort of long-term plan, I will, once I've developed a little bit of an understanding, I tend to have a sense of humor about things. But I will say to them, well, when we put all this together and I've got all this information, we can actually do pretty much the perfect plan. Well, how can you do that? I said, but you only have to tell me two things. First, there's two parts. Are you going to a nursing home? And if so, month, day, and year that you're going. And actually, what's even more important is tell me exactly what day you're going to die. Because with everything we have in front of us, if I know those two dates, it becomes a giant word problem from high school math. Because you have those two certainties. But obviously, we don't have those. So therefore, what you try to do is to anticipate, based upon health, based upon age, based upon resources, finances, try to help folks develop a plan that can work for them. And also understand that it's not cast in concrete when you walk out the door, because if nothing ever changes in your life, then this should work. But if there are changes, then we revisit it. It stays fluid. But, and that's the thing. But at the same time, we, in our office, and I know many of my colleagues, around the state, deal all the time in what's more euphemistically called, I guess, crisis planning, where people haven't done any planning. And it's, oh my goodness, mom or my husband or my wife or dad just, ended up in the hospital, and then they have to go to a nursing home for rehab, and they may have to stay there for the duration. And after we spend all our money, how long before they take our house? Well, a couple of hours later, we realize that with a husband and wife, there are so many things that can be done that maybe they're not going to take any of your money, at least for the first spouse in the nursing home. So there's always something that can be done. People walk in the door, and I say to them sometimes, well, the bad news is that your situation is, really kind of dire right now. It's about as bad as it can be. The good news is there's nothing any of us can do to make it any worse. We can only make it better. So let's see how much better we can make it.
Once again, you see how important, and believe me, and I emphasize that importance, to contact and sit down with an elder affairs attorney. And granted, but plan your work and work your plan, so that all of a sudden, if a situation may arise, you're not cut short. And it's very easy to get cut short because, I haven't planned anything, I'm fine. You never know. And the older one gets, it is better to plan and put things aside, that if that situation arises, they have an attorney that can go ahead and help them. Because if you're out there in the middle of Nowheresville with nobody, you've really got a problem.
It's well put.
Well, Jack, I see, and I'm going to leave it to you. You wanted to do it.
No, not this time.
Well,
you still get the wrap up.
The old clock on the wall is telling me it's about time to close. But I do want to emphasize one point. It's very, very important for the elderly to take advantage. Believe it or not, you'll rest a lot better knowing that security is there. And in closing, Jack, is there anything you'd like to add before we say good night?
No, I think that pretty much covers it, Jack. Just be aware of your situation. Know what I guess the one thing I would add that I tell folks all the time is, what do you want to do? And then we find a way to do that. We talked a lot tonight about, Medicaid and nursing homes and all those dire things. There are so many other living situations. We can do another show down the road talking about other options and alternatives for folks who just get tired of shoveling the snow and cutting the lawn, and climates and environments, things that work for people that have nothing to do with Medicaid. So that's the first question to ask yourself is, what do I want to do? What am I looking forward to at whatever point you are on the road?
So you see by the conversation, very important. Other areas, and I'm hoping that I have the pleasure of sitting with Mr. McNicholas and talking about other specific areas that are important to you. Jack, it's been a pleasure.
As always, thank you.
This is Jack Peterson wishing you and yours the very best. Good night.